my water just broke. I felt like things really intensified.
She was right there and she was coming.
It was an amazing feeling.
I'm gonna cry just thinking about it. I could feel her head.
We heard her cry. We were squeezing hands and she was screaming.
I'm Bryn Hunt Palmer, and you're listening to The Birth Hour. This podcast is designed as a safe place to come together and share childbirth stories. Stick around and join us to hear informative and empowering birth journeys from all over the world. Today's episode is in partnership with Needed. The prenatal vitamin industry is failing us, leaving 95% of us depleted during one of the most nutritionally demanding times in our life. There's overwhelming evidence that higher standards of nutrition will improve fertility, birth outcomes, and the trajectory of life. Despite this, most prenatal vitamins are peddling bare minimum nutrition. Needed goes way beyond bare minimums to deliver products that can fully meet the needs of our minds, bodies, and babies. Their radically better nutritional system is third-party tested and rigorously developed with the knowledge of thousands of women's health experts and pioneering science. In addition to their prenatal multivitamin powder, I personally love their pre/probiotics, which provide for an optimal gut and vaginal microbiome, as well as assisting with iron absorption, which is such a challenge for many of us, especially during pregnancy. I relied so much on this during my recent appendicitis recovery, and I recommend them to everyone. Needed has all of your needs covered from preconception to postpartum and beyond. Needed also simplifies things by bundling core products you need into easy and flexible monthly plans. Use code BIRTHHOUR for 25% off your first subscription and up to 40% off monthly plans at thisisneeded.com. At the end of this episode, I have a more in-depth chat with Julie from Needed all about their products and the benefits of using Needed. Okay, before we get to today's birth story, I just wanted to chat a little bit about a couple other aspects of the Birth Hour community. If you're new to the podcast, you may not know that we also have an online childbirth course. It's called Know Your Options. It's 12 modules of all evidence-based information where I've partnered with a childbirth educator, a birth and postpartum doula, and lactation counselor to cover everything from final weeks of pregnancy through preparing for your birth, any type of birth. We go over everything, starting with planned cesareans and going through unmedicated versus medicated inductions, really any kind of thing that might come up for you so that you can be prepared no matter how your birth goes. And then, of course, we talk about postpartum and caring for your baby. And then there's a bonus course that comes with that is called Beyond the First Latch, where we talk about feeding baby, pumping, storing milk, going back to paid work, all of those things. That's an additional 6 modules that is free with the main course, or you can buy it separately. You can find out more about the course, including detailed outlines of everything included at thebirthhour.com/course. And along with that, you also get access to a private Facebook group just for our childbirth course students and bi-weekly Zoom calls where we get together and get your questions answered or just connect and find community. We have so many people in there in all different stages. A lot of second and even third time moms right now are joining the calls, and it's really fun to hear from each other from everything from breech babies and getting baby to turn to potty training and adjusting to having a new baby in the house for older siblings, things like that. So again, that's thebirthhour.com/course, and you can use the coupon code 100OFF for $100 off enrollment. And if you love listening to this episode and you want to hear more birth stories, head over to patreon.com/birthhour and become a Patreon member to get access to our archives of episodes, which has over 600 additional episodes. So you can hear all the different types of births. We've been making this podcast since 2015, so there's a lot to listen to. You'll also get access to our private Facebook group with your Patreon membership, which is a really great place to find community and get questions answered. I will link to the Know Your Options course and the Patreon page from this podcast app where you're listening to this episode, as well as on the website, thebirthhour.com. Today's birth story guest is Kayla, and she has 2 stories to share. Her first was a hospital induction due to her baby being estimated to be a large size. And then her second is a home birth, which was a really great redemptive experience. She also talks about challenges with feeding and postpartum, different challenges with different babies, which is always such a great example of, you never know what to expect. Every baby is different. All right, let's hear from Kayla. Hi, Kayla. Welcome to the Birth Hour. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I'm excited. You have 2 stories to share. But before we get to that, can you tell listeners a little bit about you and your family?
Yeah, so my name is Kayla, and I'm married to my partner, Josh. We've been married almost 7 years. We have 2 kids, and we just love to be parents and garden and make our house a home.
All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with your first pregnancy and how that went.
Yeah, so in 2019, I started listening to the birth hour and it became like totally obsessed with birth. And just from listening to the stories, like I knew I wanted a home birth, but I was like too nervous or too afraid of judgment to like actually like go through with it. It was just super uncommon for like my area, the people in my life. It would just be like really kind of out of left field. So, but from listening to the episodes that you aired, I learned a lot about like what oral ties were, which will come into play later. I kind of learned a lot just from listening to the women on your podcast and the stories that they told. There would be some stories with like NICU stays, and I could not bring myself to listen to those because it was just like too much to think about even going there. So I say this kind of as a preface to what's going to come into play later. But I got pregnant with my first pretty quickly after getting my IUD removed. And I started with an OB initially, but after 2 visits, I knew that it was not the care that I was looking for. When I brought up at my 8-week appointment as a first-time mom that I wanted to go unmedicated, I kind of felt like a little like laughed at like, okay, well, we'll see. And they would just they'd come in the room and they wouldn't even like sit down and talk to us. They would just kind of stand over us, and it just wasn't my cup of tea. So shortly after starting care with them, I actually transferred my care to a group of CNMs, certified nurse midwives, who would deliver in the hospital. And from my first appointment with them, I immediately felt just way more comfortable, even just to ask questions to them. I didn't feel like really comfortable in the first OB's office. So initially I thought that I had found a really good happy medium because it did feel night and day from my first few experiences. So one thing that stands out in my pregnancy with my first was I did the 28-week gestational diabetes test, and I failed that test. They called me and they said, we like to see the numbers to come back at 40 or below, and you were at 43, so just over, but we really want you to come in and do like the fasted 3-hour glucose test. And that was really intimidating for me. I don't do well with needles, and the thought of like getting my blood drawn repeatedly kind of just made me sick to my stomach. And doing on a fasted stomach, it was not something I was really looking forward to, and I was really hoping I would not have to do that test. But we went and did it, and I did pass that with flying colors. So they ruled out that I had gestational diabetes. But then by 37 weeks, 38 weeks, and then at 39 weeks, I was measuring ahead and measuring ahead and measuring ahead. At my 39-week appointment, I was measuring 44 centimeters, so like I was 44 weeks pregnant. So they suggested strongly that I go and get an ultrasound to make sure that it wasn't like my fluid levels weren't super high, or to see like what was maybe going on with like the size of my baby. So we went in for that ultrasound, and the ultrasound tech was doing her thing. And, you know, I look at the screen, I'm not understanding what she's looking at, but she kind of did like, oh, there's the heart, oh, there's this. And then she kind of went quiet, and she was looking and looking and looking at something, like repeatedly measuring something. And then after about 10 minutes, she's like, you know, I'm still kind of new at this. I need to go they had a maternal fetal medicine specialist where they were doing the ultrasound. So she's like, I'm going to go get the MFM and have him just double check some things. So she stepped out of the room, and I was kind of like already a little bit nervous, and she came back in with him, and he like took one look, and he's like, yep, that all looks right. And he turned to me and he's like, so when's your induction date? And we were planning, like I said, I wanted to give birth unmedicated, and I was wanting to go as natural as possible. So an induction was not something I was interested in. And I just said, oh, you know, we're not going to have an induction. I'm just planning on going into labor naturally. And he kind of was like, okay, well, we'll have your provider call you. And then he walked out of the room. And me and my husband were like, that was just a weird interaction altogether, from the ultrasound tech to the doctor. But whatever they said, my fluids were on the higher end of normal, but not like abnormally high, nothing to like really be scared about. So later that night, we were sitting down eating dinner, and I get a call from one of the midwives. It was a group of 4 midwives that were just rotating. And the midwife who gave me a call, I'd only seen her once in all of my prenatal care. And she just went, "Oh my gosh, your baby's huge." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And she asked if they had told me. And I said, "No, they just said that you guys would call me." And she's like, "Well, your baby is estimated to be 11 and a half pounds. And my stomach dropped. Like, what? That's insane. That's huge. And like, I knew enough to know that ultrasound measurements are off anywhere from like 1 to 2 pounds. But I was still like, holy cow, that is a big baby. Even if we're 2 pounds off 9.5 pounds, that's huge. And it's either direction too. Like, they could be up to 2 pounds bigger.
Oh yeah. Gosh, that's not the thought you want.
No, I mean, I didn't think it would be necessarily bigger, but still, even like 2 pounds less, that's 9.5 pounds. As a first time mom, it's like, oh my gosh, that's so big.
Yeah.
So at this point in time, my husband and I had done the Know Your Options course. And I mean, I was so like on top of it. I think we did it when I was not even 20 weeks pregnant. We had like finished everything, but we were like, okay, well, we need to go back and revisit like everything, because this birth is going to look differently than I think what we have been anticipating and hoping for. So we did go through the modules again, specifically around induction. Mm-hmm. I knew I was dilated enough that I probably wouldn't need to do like a Foley bulb. That wouldn't really be helpful. I think I was measuring at a 3 at the time. So I was like, oh, probably not a Foley bulb. We'll probably just start right on Pitocin, and if I were to go through with an induction. So I called the midwives and asked if I could come in for a membrane sweep and give it a couple days and see if that would kickstart anything. And if it didn't, we would go ahead and go through with an induction on Saturday, which was 3 days later. So I went in for a sweep. She's like, yep, you're 3 centimeters dilated. You're 80% effaced. So, I mean, this could work. It could not. It's just up to chance and if baby's ready. And I had started having contractions after that for the next 3 days, but they were really hard to tell, like when they started versus when they ended. They would just get like really, really intense, really, really intense, and then they just kind of fade. So I was kind of thinking that they were just Braxton Hicks. But when we got to the hospital, when we first got there and they put me on the monitors, she was like, "Oh, you're having a contraction. Can you tell?" And I was like, well, I mean, I thought this was just a Braxton Hick. I mean, I don't really know. I don't have anything to compare it to. But I guess when we did show up, I was having contractions. So when we got there and they were trying to place the IV to start the Pitocin, they were going to try to do it like in the side of my forearm, so I could still have like access to my hands. But every place they tried in that arm, it just wasn't taking. And they had to eventually call in the charge nurse to come in. And even she was struggling to place the IV. So eventually they did just have to put that in my hand, which was like, so we're already having an induction, which was not on my radar that would even be a thing that would be happening. And now I'm already starting to feel physically compromised with my hand. And then the IV stand and then the monitors. We had called ahead and asked if they had wireless monitors, and they said they did. But when we got there, they seemed to not really know what I was talking about. And they're like, "Oh no, we don't have anything like that." So they only had the wired monitors. But we got in and we got settled, and I spent the first couple hours just resting. I knew that was going to be really important. So I just rested and did the mile circuit for the first couple hours. And then things kind of started to pick up from there. I didn't really feel much happening until we'd probably been on the Pitocin for 4 or 5 hours, and then I was starting to really feel things pick up. One of my really good friends was acting as my doula. I should mention this was during the end of the COVID restrictions. They actually lifted the COVID restrictions the day after I had my son. So I was only allowed 2 people in the labor room. And then once I delivered my son, I was only allowed to have one of those 2 people present at a time. So like those 2 people could switch off, but I couldn't have 2 people together in the postpartum unit. So my friend was standing in as my doula, and she had set up these beautiful LED candles to kind of like set the mood and set the tone. And at one point, this nurse walked in and she saw them and she just turned and booked it out. And then like 3 nurses ran back in and they were like, "Oh, those are just fake."
Oh my gosh.
I don't know. That's just kind of a funny thing to look back on. Like it didn't feel as naturally friendly there. We did end up switching hospitals after I found out how large my son was potentially going to be. So to one that had a better NICU team there. So it was like they didn't even know what these LED candles were. They thought that we had actually like lit real candles in the hospital, which is a huge safety risk for all of the reasons. But no, they were just fake. We were just trying to set the mood for laboring. At one point, I remember saying to my husband that I couldn't do it anymore, but in my head, I just knew if I got an epidural, that would probably be the end of giving birth vaginally to my son. With what we knew about his potential size, I knew that gravity was going to be super, super important in helping him come down.
Yeah.
So somehow I kept on going. My doula was really great at placing really cool ice cold rags on the back of my neck and on my forehead, which was super helpful because I was just so hot. They did a lot of hip squeezes. My husband and my doula would just stand on both sides and just put their entire body weight on my hips, which just made everything super manageable. And from the time things got really intense to the time I started to feel like I was ready to push, I was pretty much just standing and swaying the whole time. It was the only thing that actually felt good. So at one point when I was laboring on the toilet, I started to feel my body starting to kind of bear down a little bit. And I was like, oh my gosh, I think I have to push. And this was really exciting because we'd been laboring all day. And I was like, oh, I think I made it. Like, I think we're ready to go here. So the nurse came in and she checked and I was a 9.5 with a cervical lip. But she's like, yeah, I mean, you're pretty much ready. And if you're feeling like you need to push, then go ahead. Let's get going. So they set up the bed. So I was pushing on my knees, but I was leaned up against the back side of the bed. So this was really great. I didn't know it at the time, but I was really kind of taking a break. I was allowing my body to just labor down. And I really took about an hour to kind of rest and recover. I would feel the contraction come. I would feel my body start to push, but I didn't really push along with it. I was just really trying to kind of get some rest in because it had been about 16 hours at that time. And after an hour of this, they were like, okay, let's switch this up because nothing's really happening. And at that point, I kind of felt a little rejuvenated and was like, okay, yep, let's go. Let's get this baby out. So they set up the squat bar on the bed for me. And I remember I had taken a hypnobirthing class and my hypnobirthing instructor had talked about the squat bar. And she had said, don't underestimate the power you get from hanging. The squat bar is really great because you can really harness this hanging power. And for whatever reason, those 2 words, hanging power, just replayed over and over and over in my head. So when a contraction would come, I would kind of get up on top of the bar and then just kind of let my body just then hang down. And it worked really well. Within 20 minutes, my son had descended to the point that he was crowning. By those LED candles that we had set up, I had this little plaque that had Jack, that's the name of my son, painted on it. So I was just looking at this plaque with my son's name and just harnessing the hanging power on the squat bar. At one point, shortly before he was born, I cracked a joke where I was like, so how big do we think this baby is going to actually be? And everybody kind of laughed. And then this is where things I feel like really kind of spiraled out of control and where a lot of the trauma kind of starts to creep in. I had not wanted to push on my back. And my midwife knew that. But at this point, she looked at me and said, I know you don't want to push on your back, but let's have you get on your back. And this is really, it's frustrating to look back on because we knew my son was most likely going to be large. And I didn't have an epidural, so I could have gotten in a more optimal upright position to allow my body the best chance at getting this baby out. But I was asked specifically to get on my back, which is not optimal, especially when you have a large baby. So I got on my back, and then at that point, his head crowned, and that's when they called a shoulder dystocia. And they turned to my husband and they said, go hit that button on the wall. And they pointed to this red button. And that absolutely freaked him out and has been something that he's had to work through. So he ran and he had to hit the code button. And the nurses and the midwife performed the McRoberts maneuver, where they pretty much pulled on my son's head and pushed on the top of my fundus to get him out. And it was very aggressive. They said, you have to get him out right now. And I just screamed, and he just popped right out. And he was born, and they put him on my belly for a couple seconds, not long at all. And then they said, we have to cut the cord and we have to take him away. So my husband miraculously was right there. He had come back after hitting the code button. He was able to cut the cord, but we didn't get to do any of the delayed cord clamping, any of the skin to skin or the golden hour, which were things that I was really, really looking forward to being able to do. So they whisked him away, and my husband went over there with him, and my friend and my doula was standing next to me, and I was just kind of in shock. And one thing I hadn't thought about up to this point was pain medication post-delivery, right after the delivery. And after he was born, I had a nurse just kind of get in my face and be like, do you want pain medication now? Because you can have pain medication now. You did it. You can have some. And I was just in such complete shock that I just kind of was like, yeah, sure. So they gave me some fentanyl through my IV. And then I had the labor shakes set in. When he was born, and with that maneuver they used, I actually had a 4th degree tear. So I had torn all the way through, and that's where that shock was coming from. So I just remember listening to my son cry and just looking over, but just being so out of my body. I couldn't even say anything. I couldn't react. I had no emotion. I just was sitting there just in complete shock. And then my friend who was standing in as my doula actually got everything on video. And there's this one point in the video about 15 minutes after he was born, this nurse, mind you, I have not even held my son yet, but there's this nurse that holds up my son Simba in The Lion King, and she's just saying, look at this baby, look at the size of this baby's huge. And looking back and watching the video, it just really hurts my heart, because at that point I hadn't even held my son, and then there's this nurse who's literally showing off my son to the room, look how big he is. And then they weighed him, and he was 10 pounds 4 ounces, and he was 22 inches long. So he was a big boy. He definitely looked like a toddler, it felt like. The NICU team had come in the room when my husband hit the call button, and he was having some issues breathing. So they came to me and they said, we're going to take him to the NICU. We're going to give him a little CPAP. This is not an official NICU admittance, but we want to take him there just to give him a little extra help right now. Would you like to hold him before we take him? And I was like, yes, I would like to hold my son. I have really held him up to this point. So they brought him over to me, and I held him. And after just a couple minutes of me holding him, his breathing was resolved and he was doing good. They took him from me and they were like, oh, wait, actually, he's doing fine. You can keep him. And then everybody left. And suddenly it was really quiet. All the chaos had kind of died down. They did call in a plastic surgeon to help stitch me up and repair the tear, which I was very grateful for. They did really excellent job. in that repair, but she was down there for probably another 30 minutes or so. But at that point, I finally had my son back. We had latched, and the birth high was like kind of starting to come back. I was kind of coming out of the fog with the pain medication, and I kind of felt like on cloud nine, like I did it. I didn't get an epidural. My baby was huge, and I was able to deliver him. And I feel pretty cool. And the nurses on staff were like, wow, we've never seen anybody like give birth to a baby that big all on their own without pain medication. So I was kind of feeling pretty cool at this time, but that quickly went away. So they took us from the labor and delivery room into the postpartum recovery floor, just one floor below. And we got about an hour and a half of sleep. And then they came in to do a blood sugar test on my son. And his numbers came back really low. And they're like, well, we'll give it a little bit more time and then we'll try it again. And that was just the beginning of many, many heel pokes this little baby would have over the next 3 to 4 days. They kept taking him away to test his blood sugar. So with that first 24 hours, we hardly got to latch. We hardly got to breastfeed. Before I knew it, I was being told, like, we need to supplement him with this high-calorie formula to help his blood sugar levels and all of this stuff. And I was seeing his blood sugar numbers come back, and I was seeing that they were low, but I was not being offered things that, looking back now, I think would have helped, like more skin to skin, like more latching, like harvesting more colostrum and feeding him that. He just kind of kept being taken away from me, and my husband would go with him to the nursery, and I was still kind of riding that birth high those first 24 hours after he was born. It just didn't really register with me, like how serious things were becoming with him. So by the end of that day, about 24 hours after he was born, they came to me and they said, we need to admit him to the NICU. And my heart just sunk because I knew that meant that I was not going to be taking my baby home with me the next day. And the process of being admitted to the NICU is honestly one of the most like traumatic things, I think, to come out of his whole birth and postpartum. It felt like it was treated like this was a huge emergency. Like we were rushed in, they were rushing to place an IV in his little teeny hand, and he was screaming, and I had a doctor just like talking at my face super loud. It just felt like there were no bedside manners at all. And it was like midnight. We had slept an hour and a half at that point, and it just felt like this big rushed chaotic event when I don't think it had to be that way. At that point, we were trying to do an SNS system because breastfeeding was something that was really important to me. And then that was just not working. They brought in a pump, which was not like the right flange size whatsoever. It was so painful. And it just became really chaotic from there. We didn't sleep at all that next night. So we were super exhausted. And then at the end of the next day, we could only stay 48 hours post-delivery. So we checked out of our room around 11 o'clock and we went upstairs and we said goodbye to our little chunky monkey. And then that drive home was the most terrible drive of my life. And then the next week was just the worst week of my life, being separated from my son. There were a couple experiences I had within the NICU with some of the nurses. And I don't mean to say this. I don't think this is all nurses. I think we just had a really poor luck of the draw. It felt like a lot like the first 4 nurses that we had were trying to kind of push us out, well-intentioned or not, under the guise of, you need to go take care of yourself, when all I wanted to do was be there next to my son. And I was told repeatedly, like, you should go home, you should rest, you should go home and take a nap, you should go home and get some food. And the only thing I wanted to do was just be there right next to my son. At that point, I was pumping every 3 hours, trying to just produce enough milk for him, trying to hold him when I could. After being there for 3 days and really not knowing when I could hold him, when I could touch him, if I could pick him up, if I could just let him sit there. You know, I'm a first-time mom. This is all new territory to me. And after being there 3 days, one of the nurses was like, I had changed him. And I guess it was outside of his cares hours. And I don't know if that's the same for like other NICUs, but she's like, did you not get the yellow packet? Did you not read the yellow packet? And I was like, I don't know what yellow packet you're talking about. So we had been there several days before we even were given like a packet that explained anything to us of what we, quote, could or could not do in that space. So after finally getting that packet, and then we had just a beautiful, wonderful nurse, things started to fill up. My son was able to come off the glucose drip, which is what they had him on to help stabilize his blood sugars. And then at that point, it was just a matter of, can this baby eat enough to maintain his own blood sugar levels? So we tried nursing, and he was not getting very much milk transfer at all. And he was getting really sleepy at the breast. And I asked several nurses, like I said, I didn't know what a tongue tie was until I had started listening to the birth hour a couple years before this. So I knew you couldn't really tell just by looking at their mouths, but just looking at my son's mouth, it was very obvious that he had a complete tongue tie all the way to the tip. It was pulling his tongue in so tightly on that tip. It looked like a little heart-shaped tip on his tongue. And I asked several of the doctors if he had a tongue tie, and they all just kind of brushed it off like, oh, maybe he will. And I asked one of the lactation consultants at the hospital, and she's like, I don't think so. He did have a really, really nasty tongue and lip tie. But like I said, he was getting like no milk transfer. So we left the NICU on bottles and oxygen. And I had little to no guidance really on how to get from bottle to breast, because like I said, breastfeeding was something that was really important to me. So I had a family member who had a baby a couple months before me, and she had used an IBCLC, and she gave me her contact information and highly recommended her. So I called this IBCLC, and she came out, and immediately she did her assessment. She specializes in like not diagnosing, because I think they're not technically supposed to diagnose, but assessing and recommending revision. But she was like, yeah, he definitely, I can't say he has a tongue tie, but he's gotten like no oral function with his tongue and his lip. She showed me, she like flanged his lip up. It blanched super, super white, and she couldn't even lift it up to his nose. So we went and got that revised, which was really great. And it took several weeks before he was able to have the oral skills and the oral strength to transfer enough milk. But by about 8 weeks, we were nearly exclusively breastfeeding, at which point I had to go back to work, which was a huge bummer. And then from there, I had an extremely fast letdown from the oversupply that was triggered by the amount of pumping that I did right after he was born, which was what I was told to do. So between his tongue and lip tie and the fast letdown and oversupply, I could only nurse him if we were sidelining for several more months after that. But we did go on to breastfeed for 18 months, which was a beautiful experience that I hold very dear to my heart. And out of everything that went on with his birth and postpartum, I'm really grateful that we were able to make it that far. So that's my son's birth. That's my first birth story.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that experience. And I know that you sought out some different things for your second birth. So let's go ahead and jump right into talking about planning for your second birth.
Yes, absolutely. So just the thought of talking about getting pregnant again, and when we were starting to kind of be like, okay, what are we going to do? I knew I wanted a completely different experience. And we never really discussed point blank that we wanted a home birth. It was just kind of something we knew was what we both wanted. And we just kind of went about planning this next birth knowing that was what we were going to do. So I began interviewing midwives, and when I would tell them the birth of my son, they all kind of said the same thing, that they wouldn't have intervened unless it had been 2 minutes. And I knew time was kind of warped. You know, time is warped when you're giving birth, but I knew he wasn't stuck for 2 minutes before the midwives in the hospital went and performed that Mick Roberts maneuver. So that was kind of playing in the back of my head, and just watching the birth video, my son would give me like an insane amount of anxiety. I would usually have to like just turn it off because I would just be crying. And anytime I would go back and watch it. So I got in with a therapist, and then shortly after I felt pregnant, and that pregnancy, I knew something was off. So I went in to get my HG levels tested. And before I even went in for the 48, they test your HG levels once, and then they want to do it 48 hours after and make sure that it's like at least doubling. So I hadn't even gone in for the second blood draw, and I had started miscarrying. And when that happened, this was when I made an account like with the hospital. And that's when I found the records from my first birth. When I was like looking and waiting to get the results for those levels, I was kind of like exploring my account, and it was like, oh, there's like all of these records from my first birth. And that's when I realized and found out that he had only been stuck 45 seconds. And a true shoulder dystocia has to be between 60 to 120 seconds, so 1 to 2 minutes. And this just kind of like reinforced everything that these home birth midwives that I was talking to, it just kind of reinforced what they were saying, that they wouldn't have even began to intervene until it had been 2 minutes. And with my son, I felt like if I would have just had a little bit more time, or could have been placed in a more optimal position, like the Gaskin maneuver, and given a little bit more time, this is when I realized I think it would have been a very different experience. So it just reinforced like, this is the route that I want to go. I want to go with a home birth midwife. I think it would have been an entirely different experience had I been with a different provider. So I was set to interview the midwife for my daughter the day after I started miscarrying. So I texted her to cancel because I was not in a place to go and interview a midwife about birth when I was currently miscarrying. And she was an angel. She took the time before even meeting me to talk me through miscarriage, anything that I could or would need, and took the time to be there with me in that space. And I hadn't even met her yet at this point in time. I just texted her and told her, and she called me. And I knew in that moment, this was the midwife that I would go with for my next pregnancy and birth. Just the care and the compassion and the consideration that she gave me, who was really, to her eyes, just a complete stranger, was unbelievable.
I'm so glad you had reached out to her before that happened and that you were able to find that support.
Yes, exactly. So I became pregnant again with my daughter, and we waited to find out the gender. So all through my pregnancy, I didn't know what she was, but I felt physically better with her. But I was way more emotional, and I would comment to my husband that I felt like this child would be very special and probably very anxious, because I had never in my life felt quite anxious like I had during this pregnancy, like really questioning relationships that I was really secure in. Like if my best friend didn't respond to my text right away, I would be like, oh my gosh, she hates me. And I'm like, why am I thinking that? Like, that's not... Yeah. Just really weird anxieties that I never quite experienced before. So I did a lot of work to heal my tear. I would do some red light therapy down there on my tear, because my biggest fear was not necessarily like having a baby or birthing at home. My biggest fear was having a tear that would be too big, that my midwife wouldn't be able to stitch it up, and that I would have to be transferred to a hospital. So we did that, and I would use some wheat germ oil, and I would put it up there every day just to help soften, relax, and heal that tissue there. I did a lot of work emotionally, but honestly, just finding my midwife and fostering that relationship with her was probably the biggest influence in my healing from my first birth. Leading up to the birth, I was definitely starting to feel things get ready. Like around 36, 37 weeks, I was like, okay, things are getting ready down there. Things are shifting. And I also started measuring ahead around this time. And I was so done with this pregnancy by the end that when I hit 38 weeks, I had talked with my midwife, and I was totally fine to try to kickstart things naturally if possible. If my baby was ready to come and they would come, great. If we would do something and the baby didn't want to come, that's fine. So at 38 weeks, my midwife came to my house. She did a foot zoning, and then she did a membrane sweep, but she popped like 6 big capsules of evening primrose oil up there when she did the sweep. And by the time she was done with the first sweep, she's like, well, you're 3 centimeters, a little thick, like maybe 50% effaced, so we'll see. And then she left, and we settled in for the night. And around 2 a.m., I started having contractions coming, and they kind of immediately started coming pretty quick. They were about 3 minutes apart, lasting like 30 to 45 seconds, but they weren't super intense. So I think that went on about an hour, and then my husband woke up and was like, are you having contractions? And I was just laying in bed, still half asleep, but just was like, yeah, I'm definitely having contractions. We just kind of laid there in bed together. And then after a couple of hours, I needed to get out of the bed. I needed to do something different. And I should mention, instead of doing a baby sprinkle or anything like that with this baby, I did a mother's blessing, which was a beautiful experience. And part of what we did at the blessing was everybody wrote down like positive birth affirmations or positive well wishes. And I had attached those little cards to a light curtain that we had hanging in our room. So we plugged in the lights, and I had the affirmations of all of these like special, important women in my life hanging there in the background. And everybody brought a bead, and then I put that bead on like a little tassel. So I had my beads, I had my affirmations, I had the lights. And after a couple hours, I looked up at my husband, and I just like almost with tears was like, oh my gosh, baby, we're doing it. Like, we're laboring at home. We're here together. This is so beautiful. And I was just super emotional at how different this was compared to my first, and how comfortable I was, and just I was feeling very, very grateful and very excited to be in this environment. This is really what I had hoped for with my first. So I knew when we were creeping up to like 6 a.m. that my son was going to wake up. And from all of the stories, I knew when he woke up, like things were going to slow down until I could get him like out the door and situated with my mom. So I didn't call the midwife. We didn't call the doula. I was going to wait to call them. But then a little bit after 6 a.m., I had a contraction that was like, okay, that was different. That was more intense. Called the doula because she lives an hour away. So she came down. My mom came over so she could be there to pick my son up and take him. And sure enough, he woke up and things slowed down. My mom took my son up to her house, and she was going to be there for the birth. So she came back down. So I had my mom, my doula, and my husband. And then things just like almost stopped. And I was trying a couple different things to get it to kind of pick up again. But I knew it was just like this audience of people was stressing me out. And it felt like performance anxiety. I couldn't get back into my labor space with all of these people here. And I felt super bad. Like, I'm so sorry to my doula. I'm like, I'm so sorry you drove an hour. She's like, don't worry about it. Like, this is my job. I'm here for you. And then I was just like, I need you to leave. She's like, I know. So she left and my mom left. And then me and my husband just kind of spent the rest of the day together. We watched some funny movies. We took a nap because we'd been up, most of the night before, and got rested. And then I was in contact with my midwife, and she's like, well, I can come over. I can do another sweep. We can see what happens. So if you're interested in that, I was like, yes, please. Like, I just labored all night. I'm like, I'm so ready, as anyone is at the end of pregnancy. So she came over and she did another sweep. She put some more evening primrose oil up there. By the end of the sweep, she was like, well, you're a 5 and you're like 90% effaced. So I'm going to leave my bag here. I'm going to go home. I'm going to get some rest. You call me when anything starts to happen. And that was around like probably 8:30 at night. It was kind of later. So she left, and this is when things got super, super fast. I feel like I had like the longest and yet the fastest and shortest labor of all time, because I had been laboring all night and like on and off all day. But after she left, things picked up really fast. So we started watching John Mulaney comedy special. She's like, watch something that'll make you laugh. And I was like, well, I like John Mulaney. So we turned on one of his comedy specials and we were just laughing, and my contractions started again. They were still about 10 minutes apart, but they were super, super intense. But they were really far apart. So I was kind of like, I don't know. I don't know if we should call people yet. I wanted to labor in the birth tub. We had a birth tub set up in our room, but I kind of had this feeling all through pregnancy that I was not going to get in that water, which is funny because I did not get in that water. By the time things kind of started to get closer together and the time I hit transition, we were too late to fill up the birth tub. So around midnight is when we called my mom and the doula and my midwife. My mom was the first to get to our house, and I was going through transition. My husband was still trying to set up the birth pool, so I was totally going through transition alone. And at one point I looked at her and I was like, I have to poop. I'm not saying that because I have to push. I'm saying that because I have to poop, which we all know what that really means. So she took me over to the toilet, and then I had one contraction on the toilet, and I looked at my husband and was like, oh no, I really am pushing. Like I have to push. I'm starting to feel it. So my midwife was on her way. The doula was on her way. And then I just had this moment of clarity where I looked at my mom and my husband and realized that I didn't think anybody had called the photographer, who is also my best friend. And I just looked at my husband and my mom and was like, did anybody call Haley? And they looked at each other and they were like, crap, no, we didn't call her. So it's funny. She got the call at 12:05 and she made it to our house at 12:30. And my daughter was born at 12:49. So everybody got there within like 30 minutes that my daughter was born. So everybody barely made it. My midwife walked in and I was still on the toilet, and she just went, oh, honey, let's get you off the toilet. And she set up the birth stool, which was like, I didn't really have any preferences when it came to pushing, but I was doing well on the toilet. She's like, we just don't have to have the baby on the toilet. We can replicate this. So she set up the birth stool, and my husband sat on the bed behind me so I could just like kind of lean into him and use his legs as support under my arms. And after every contraction, I would just kind of like just melt back into him. And he was just this beautiful source of comfort right there. My midwife was saying the most like beautiful grounding things to me. I couldn't tell you exactly what she was saying, but like things to the effect of like, your body's working perfectly. You and your baby are working together. Your baby's on their way. Everything is fine. Everything is going smoothly. You're doing the work. Just these gorgeous grounding affirmations. And she prepared me, you know, she's like, your bag of waters is bulging. Once it pops, things are going to get really intense. And shortly after that, my waters broke, it was like this really big, loud pop, this really big gush. And in the moment, I remember being like, oh, that was so cool. Because with my son, I had my waters broken for me. So to have those pop like on their own was just a really cool feeling. But then I felt my daughter just go thunk, just like boom, she just slid down, which listening to all of the birth podcast, when people would talk about like feeling their baby descending, I was like, I didn't really feel that. I would love to feel that. That would be so cool. But I did feel it with my daughter. I felt her descend. And then within a couple pushes, her head was born. Oh, my midwife said, she has so much hair. Reach up there and feel her hair. And I like reached up and I could feel her hair. It was like so long, just like hanging. It was the weirdest feeling to feel her hair. But yeah, just a couple pushes, her head was born, and then her body came out really quickly after. She was put immediately onto my chest and I held her. She came out screaming. It's so cool because I have this on video too. She was like moving, everything was fine, but you could just see the moment when like just life just like kind of lit up in her when she went from like kind of purplish to just pink. It just is so cool to be able to go back and watch that moment.
That is cool.
Oh, so beautiful. So I held her for a few minutes and then they got the bed set up behind me. And this is like just the coolest thing, like holding your baby in your arms, like umbilical cord, placenta still inside, still attached to you, and standing up, holding your baby and moving to the bed, just like it was an everyday thing. My mom was so in awe about all of this, but that moment was really cool, being able to just stand up and then get into bed. And then we snuggled and it felt like everybody in the room disappeared. I don't know where. My midwife's downstairs. Within like a couple minutes, I had like this fruit bowl with cheese brought to me and was eating this delicious fruit. And then another like 10 or 15 minutes later, I had like an egg and cheese omelet. And my midwife walked up and was like, here, eat this. And I'm like, okay, this is delicious. So we got some really great nourishing food right after she was born. And then we were all just there. It was about 15 minutes after she was born where I was like, well, should we see what we have? We hadn't even like looked at the gender yet, but we looked and found out she was a girl. And I like thought my whole pregnancy, I was like, it's a girl. It's a girl. I just feel like it's a girl. I had wanted to do a cord burning ceremony, but at this point in time, I was so tired. It was late. It was the middle of the night. And I was like, you know what? This was perfect. I'm so tired. I don't care. Let's just cut it. And everybody was like, are you sure? Are you sure? And like still to this day, I'm like, that was totally fine. We didn't have to do that. Maybe if we were all a little bit more energized, but we were all so tired. I just wanted to just snuggle in bed with my baby and just fall asleep. So we cut the cord and my midwife had this, like the thing she put on the umbilical cord was like this little rubber tie, which was so soft and so amazing for skin to skin rather than like this big like plastic thing. I couldn't even tell you exactly what she used, but whatever she used was so much better. And then it was probably 50 minutes to an hour later that I delivered the placenta. It came out. She showed it to me. Everything was great. But she's like, I think you tore. We checked, and I did have a 2nd-degree tear. But she stitched me up, and then she left. And it was just me and my husband and my baby in our bed, snuggled up. And it was so beautiful. So night and day different than the experience with my son. So yeah, that's her birth story.
All right. Well, I love that beautiful birth story. And I know that postpartum has been a little different. So let's hear what was going on with that for you.
Okay, so the first 3 days postpartum were blissful and amazing. The 4th day, I did have a postpartum preeclampsia scare. My swelling got really bad, and my grandma was visiting, and I remember looking at her, and it was like my vision just went tunnel vision. And we did some blood work, and everything came back fine. But for the next 2 weeks, I was having some weird like vision things where it felt like I was underwater. It felt like I would kind of get this weird tunnel vision going. And she made me this electrolyte drink. We figured it was just some sort of weird fluid imbalance. So the drink was like honey, salt, and lemon. heat it up, and I would drink that 3 times a day, and it helped. And the swelling like almost immediately went down after we did that. My daughter had severe colic. We had her assessed for a tongue and a lip tie the day after she was born, and everything looked great. But after 4 weeks, I knew something was still wrong. She was transferring milk just fine, but she was so angry all the time. We had done craniosacral therapy and we had done chiropractic care, but she was still crying. I had cut out dairy for 3 weeks. Nothing changed. So we had her assessed again. And within that time frame, something somehow changed where she was super restricted with her tongue and her lip. So we had that assessed and revised. The biggest thing I want to highlight is between all of this, she also had silent reflux. When we put her on medication for silent reflux, within 3 days, she was an entirely different baby. Like physically, you could see her, like her body was just relaxed. But with all of that, she developed a feeding aversion, which was something I had never really heard about. So she, bottle or breast, if she took any milk into her mouth, she would cry, scream, and refuse it. So we discovered that feeding her if she was asleep or drowsy worked. And we did sleep feeding like that for 8 weeks while I desperately looked for somebody to help us. I worked with 3 different IBCLCs, and everybody was kind of like, well, she's eating and she's eating enough, and now her weight gain is okay. So just keep doing what you're doing. And I couldn't, no one can sustain feeding their baby if they're asleep indefinitely. So I did find a company called Baby Care Advice in Australia that specializes in infant feeding aversions. And within 5 days, my daughter's feeding aversion was pretty much reversed. We are still nursing pretty much exclusively now, but we just learned she just doesn't eat as much as what we are told babies should eat. But that's the only way she's happy. And if you try to pressure her or force her to eat more, like that you think she should eat, that kind of starts to trigger that aversion back. So I never heard about infant feeding aversions. Anyone I talked to, nobody really had any help there. So this company, she has a book called Your Baby's Bottle Feeding Aversion. Same like principles apply for breastfeeding, but we found very quickly that applying these guidelines really helped reverse that aversion, and it made all the difference.
That's so good. Yeah, that's a lot to overcome and figure out, but it sounds like you found kind of like the perfect recipe for getting her what she needed.
We did. It took a while, but we're grateful for all of the people that were able to help us.
Yeah, and unexpected after having those first blissful days and blissful home birth and all of that. It's like it's always something, it seems like I've learned with these stories.
Yep. It's a lot for them to figure out how to be a human too. It's not just us. There's a whole other person in the equation. So
right. All right. Well, thanks for sharing your stories. Do you want to share any resources?
Yes, I have several resources, so I will just say them really fast. I loved, obviously, the Birth Hour. I've been a Birth Hour fan for over 5 years now. The Doing It at Home podcast was really great as we were planning for a home birth. Birthing Outside the Box was another one that I really enjoyed. As far as books, Ina May Gaskin's Guide to Childbirth, Babies Are Not Pizzas. I completed my doula training when I was pregnant, so the birth partner was excellent. One thing we really focused on with my daughter was nutrition, so Real Food for Pregnancy was really, really great, really helpful. The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding, although as much as I love this book, I feel like both of my babies just did not fall within this like normal breastfeeding relationship. But the Instagram accounts, Badass Mother Birther and Midwife Angelina, are 2 of my favorites. And then, like I said, Baby Care Advice for the feeding aversion. And then I have a locally run Positive Birth Circle. It's ran by 3 doulas, and that I attended their birth circle once a month. And just being in that environment with those people was very, very helpful and healing during the pregnancy of my second.
Great. That's a nice list. We'll put those on your show notes. And then what's the best way for people to connect with you?
People can reach out to me on Instagram. My personal account is private, but my doula account is public, so anybody can message me there. It's at conquer.birth.doula.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much again, Kayla.
Thank you, Bryn.
And now we're going to chat with Julie from Needed, today's sponsor, all about their vitamins and supplements that are so great for all different stages. All right, let's get to that chat with Julie. Hi, Julie. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today to chat with me about Needed.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, we've been sharing about Needed for a couple months now, and I'm excited to kind of dive deeper into the products you guys offer. But before we get to that, can you share with listeners just a little bit about you and your role at Needed?
Yeah, sure. So I am the co-founder and co-CEO of Needed. I started Needed with my business school classmate and friend, Ryan. And day to day, I oversee marketing for us, and Ryan oversees our product development and operations side of the business. But yeah, I am a mom of 2 girls. I live in LA, and that's where Ryan lives as well. But our team is mostly moms, and we are located all throughout the country.
I love it. It sounds like the perfect business to kick off when you have 2 little ones.
Absolutely.
All right. So tell us a little bit about how the company got started and what your goals were with creating it.
Yeah. So Ryan and I met when we were in business school, and both of us were trained nutritionists and obsessed lifelong nutrition nerds. Neither of us were practicing nutritionists at the time, but we were really the most health conscious among our friends. And we were both really shocked to discover through nutritional testing that we had massive nutrient deficiencies. And both of us had multiple nutrient deficiencies, like 5 to 10 each. And they were both in like a critical deficiency stage. And that was really surprising to us because we were doing what we thought were all of the right things, like shopping at the farmer's market and preparing our own food and taking supplements. So we dove into the research and discovered that we were not alone in having these needs. Over 95% of women have nutrient deficiencies, and that's despite 97% of women in this life stage, the perinatal stage, taking a prenatal vitamin. So that was a real aha moment for us. And at the same time, many of our friends were starting their fertility, pregnancy, or postpartum journeys, and a lot of them were struggling with, the day-to-days of finding a prenatal, and then also on the other side, some real complications of pregnancy or difficulty with feeling their best or difficulty conceiving. And it was shocking how much of an afterthought nutrition was. We knew from our nutritional training that nutrition can be so supportive of a healthy pregnancy, conception, postpartum, really all facets of a mom and baby's health. But nutrition wasn't being used in a therapeutic way. It was like, just take a prenatal vitamin. They're all the same. It doesn't really matter which one you take. And that just isn't true. So that was the aha moment that led us to decide to redesign the prenatal vitamin and the other products that women need from the ground up. And that is really important because most products on the market aren't custom formulated. They're really just a copy of what's easily available, something called whitelisting, which basically means that a product is produced in a stock way, and then brands are just putting their own branding on top of them. And that's how we got to the place that we're at now, where most prenatal vitamins aren't meeting women's needs. And we really wanted to be the solution to that, which meant custom formulating our products. And to do so, we work closely with perinatal nutrition and health practitioners that are regularly testing women's nutrient and hormone levels in this life stage to know what is optimal and what's needed. That's how we landed on the company name, because we were really trying to help women meet their needs in an optimal way, not just meet the bare minimums.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And I love that the website is thisisneeded.com. Okay, so then let's focus on, you have a lot of different products and plans that can be catered to different stages, but I think a great place to start is the complete plan. So let's talk a little bit about that. And especially I'm interested in the choice to have a powder for the prenatal multi versus a capsule.
Yeah. So the first products that we launched in 2020 make up our complete plan. It's a 4-part protocol that includes a prenatal vitamin, an omega-3, a pre and probiotic, and a collagen protein. We included all four because they really are the foundational products that meet your micronutrient, microbiome, and macronutrient needs. Protein is such an important component of a healthy pregnancy to support blood pressure, blood sugar regulation, and then postpartum for healing. Collagen protein is really uniquely suited to do so. And what I didn't realize until I was in this life stage is that one of the amino acids in collagen, glycine, is conditionally essential in pregnancy, meaning your body can't produce it on its own. It needs to consume it through food. And the placenta is actually made up of collagen. So we're not including it just for the skin and gut health benefits that collagen is known for, but really for this foundational need that women have in this life stage. And to answer your question around powder, we started with a powder prenatal because of a few reasons. One is that a lot of women struggle to take capsules, especially in pregnancy. And if you have any form of nausea or indigestion, that can be even more difficult. But also with a powder, we are able to dose nutrients in their optimal form and in dosages that are really meaningful. It's kind of a space constraint to fit everything that you need in a prenatal into 1 or 2 pills a day or a handful of gummies. It's just not possible, especially for some of the most critical nutrients like choline. It's a really bulky nutrient. And so what you see most commonly is that prenatal vitamins don't include it, or they dose it at a really small amount that isn't meaningful. And we wanted to dose at the optimal levels and in optimal forms that your body can readily use and put to work. And the powdered form was really an optimal way to be able to deliver that. We now offer our prenatal vitamin in 3 different forms, though. We have a powder, we have a capsule form, and we have what we call our essentials, which is a pared down version of our capsule prenatal for times when you just can't take more than a couple pills a day. So it's perfect for first trimester nausea, or for some women who have nausea all throughout their pregnancy. Our essentials version is a really popular choice.
Right, because to your point, too, getting enough of what you need of those nutrients for the main capsule option, it's 8 capsules a day, which feels like a lot probably to some people.
A lot of women will break it up. They'll take like 2 or 3 in the morning, and then a few more with lunch and a few more before bedtime. So that divided dosing can be a good way to get in all 8 capsules in a day. But I personally really like having the flexibility to switch between powder and capsules. Sometimes if I make a smoothie in the morning, I like to take my powder, but on days where I don't make a smoothie, or where, I'm just in the mood for capsules instead, or having something different for breakfast than a smoothie, it's nice to be able to take the capsules. And you can actually take a half a dose of each to divide it up. So there's a lot of flexibility between the options.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Yeah, I know when I was pregnant, I struggled with my iron levels. And so I was always trying to really put a lot of spinach in my smoothie in the morning. And it would have been so great to be able to just add in my prenatal and feel like I was accomplishing this big thing first thing every day.
Totally. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned iron. Iron is a really interesting nutrient. It's a nutrient that many women will need in pregnancy, but not throughout the entire stage. Some women need more than others. Our bodies are unique. And so we actually offer iron as a separate add-on, not as an ingredient in our prenatal vitamin, because iron and calcium compete for absorption in the body. You want both, but you want to take them at different times of day. And for those who are really prone to nausea, iron can make nausea worse. So it's helpful to be able to take it right before you go to bed instead of having it in your prenatal vitamin and, that making you nauseous when you take it first thing in the day. So our iron is a really popular add-on. And in general, we're building products that work together in a system so that you can customize your routine to meet your needs. The complete plan, those 4 products are the core, but we have other targeted nutrient add-ons like our iron. We also offer a targeted choline add-on and a vitamin D for times when you need more of those nutrients. And then we also have products that meet specific needs like sleep support and stress support and hydration support. And our latest product, which I'm super excited about, our immune support, which is a product that you can take during pregnancy, postpartum, but you can also give it to your kids.
Nice.
And for those who are listening who are moms, many of us are very familiar with the fact that kids get sick on average 6 to 12 times per year. And if you have more kids at home, you typically have more sick days. There's some really interesting research around what fraction of the year your household has some form of a virus, and it goes up and up and up with each kid. So I love our Immune Support. It's an elderberry flavored powder that has prebiotics, postbiotics, zinc, and elderberry, and it tastes amazing. And that's a really good example of the way we're thinking about designing products that really meet your needs. We want to be the brand that can support women all throughout this journey, from fertility through pregnancy, through postpartum, through maybe considering having more kids in the future, and growing with our consumer as she becomes a mom and goes through the next stages of her life.
Yeah, and everything is just so clearly laid out on the website. I just really encourage everyone to go check it out because it's very easy to navigate. Everything is clearly labeled as to when you might need things, whether it's vegan or vegetarian. I just really love what you guys have put together as far as the user experience as well. And I've personally tried several of the products, and everything, especially the powders I've tried, have been really tasty. The sleep one I've been loving. That has magnesium in it, right?
Yeah, magnesium, L-theanine, chamomile, and glycine. All of them are really supportive of relaxation and sleep. And most importantly, there's no melatonin in it. You don't have any of that next day sluggishness that you can get with some sleep products. And it's pregnancy safe, which is amazing for if you are dealing with pregnancy insomnia, which I certainly did with both of my pregnancies.
Yes, I would have loved to have had that as like a little nightcap during pregnancy.
It's also awesome when you're, when I personally, when I was, doing night feedings, I felt like I could fall asleep at the drop of a pin, but it was awesome for my husband to be able to take because he didn't have those hormonal, sleepiness that happens when you're breastfeeding or pumping and you have the oxytocin release, which can make you really drowsy. So he loved taking it in those early newborn days to be able to fall back asleep after being woken up at night by a hungry baby.
I don't know. I'd probably be like hoarding it from my husband, but I'm sure you have plenty in your house.
That is one benefit of being the founder of the company. We're always stocked up.
Yes. All right. Well, any final words or things you want to highlight?
Maybe just one other thing. We've been talking a lot about the products that Needed offers, which we're really proud to be recommended by practitioners. We have over 3,000 practitioners that recommend our products. But the other huge part of our mission is to help empower women and educate them. So much of this journey is overwhelming, and it can be so difficult to know what nutrition you need at what stage. And oftentimes we hear that women aren't getting enough of that information from their OB visits or sometimes from their midwife visits as well. And so we're really building through our practitioner collective, we're building an educational resource via our website, via our social media, where you can come and get expert information about meeting your needs through nutrition and through other things in this life stage, like making decisions about where to birth or decisions about what kind of postpartum care you need. So I would really encourage listeners to check out those educational resources. One that I'll just mention that's a free resource that we're really happy to be able to provide is the most comprehensive review of prenatal vitamins. There are a lot of prenatals on the market, and through our practitioner community, we've reviewed over 75 of the leading ones. So if you have questions about the prenatal vitamin that you're taking or a couple that you're considering, you can check out that resource via our website, thisisneeded.com, and download it and talk to your practitioner about it. Or if you have any follow-up questions, you can always reach out to our team. Our customer support team is amazing, and it's staffed by trained perinatal nutritionists. So we really have that expert level of information throughout all aspects of our company.
Oh, that's so great. Yeah, I know many of our listeners are very into evidence-based information and are, big research nerds. So that sounds like a great resource. So again, people just head over to thisisneeded.com, and we do have a coupon code right now. It's birth hour for 20% off, which I will be sure to link to where you're listening to this podcast and also on the website. Thank you so much, Julie, for your time today. It was so great chatting with you.
Thank you for having me. As a longtime listener, it's really a pleasure to be able to work with you.
All right. Thank you so much again to Kayla for sharing her stories with us and to Needed for sponsoring this episode. Head over to thisisneeded.com and check out their offerings. Use the code BIRTHHOUR. I will link to everything from today's show notes, which you can find by heading over to thebirthhour.com and searching for Kayla's name in the search bar.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, head to thebirthhour.com and click Become a Member to pledge your support. And as a thank you, you'll get an invitation to join our private Facebook group and access to exclusive episodes. Your vote of confidence and support means the world to me.